Hello, everyone. Welcome to Dead Time Stories. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. All right, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's story. The bus wheezed to a stop on the cracked asphalt, its headlights casting long, trembling shadows across the overgrown gravel lot. For a moment, the only sound was the low hum of the engine and the faint hiss of brakes cooling in the cold night air. Elise pressed her palm to the window, the glass fogging instantly under her touch. Beyond it, the outline of the old boarding house rose like a silhouette from a dream she didn't want to remember. Tall, narrow, and hunched forward as if eavesdropping on the world below. The driver, a wiry man with eyes too pale to seem alive, turned his head just enough to say, "End of the line." She stepped down onto the cracked pavement, her suitcase's wheels catching in the weeds growing through the gaps. The moment her feet hit the ground, the bus doors closed with a sigh that sounded almost relieved. She watched as the taillights faded into the distance, swallowed by the darkness of the winding road. The boarding house's sign swung lazily in the night breeze, the painted letters half flaked away. Marrow House. A single porch light burned above the front steps, not so much illuminating the doorway as exposing it. A pale halo in the mist, revealing peeling paint and warped boards. She climbed the steps, each groan of the wood beneath her, a reminder that this place was not just old, but weary. When she knocked, the sound echoed inside longer than seemed natural. After a pause, the door opened a crack. A woman stood there, thin as the door frame itself, her hair pinned back in a way that felt decades out of date. Her eyes swept Elise from head to toe, not curious but measuring. "You're late," the woman said, her voice flat but not unkind. "The bus," Elise began. "They always blame the bus," the woman replied, opening the door wider. "Come in before you let the night in." The air inside was warm, thick with the scent of old varnish and something faintly metallic, like coins left too long in the rain. The entryway stretched into a narrow hallway lined with framed photographs, each one tilted slightly off-kilter. Faces stared out from behind the glass, men, women, children, every one of them unsmiling. The woman shut the door with a quiet click. "I'm Mrs. Crow. You'll be in room 5. Keep your shoes off in the hallway and don't wander at night. The house settles." She said it as though the word settles carried a meaning Elise would learn soon enough. Mrs. Crow led her upstairs, the banister smooth from decades of hands, and stopped at a narrow door. The key turned with an almost reluctant twist. Inside, the room was simple, a single bed, a desk beneath a narrow window, and heavy curtains drawn tight. Elise set her suitcase down, the thump sounding far louder than it should have in the close air. Mrs. Crow lingered in the doorway. "If you hear anything after midnight, don't answer." Before Elise could ask, the woman was gone, her footsteps fading into the creaks of the floorboards. Elise sat on the bed. The springs complained softly, and somewhere deep within the walls, something shifted, too slow to be a mouse, too deliberate to be the building settling. The clock on the desk read 11:47 p.m. The air felt heavy, as if it were listening. Then, from the hallway came the first knock. It was not the brisk, practical rap of someone calling for attention. This knock was soft, too soft. 3 slow taps spaced so far apart that Elise had to strain to decide whether they were even meant to be heard. Her first instinct was to think of Mrs. Crow, perhaps returning with more instructions or a blanket, but the quality of the sound wasn't right. It wasn't knuckles against wood. It was hollow. She glanced at the door. The key still sat in the lock from when Mrs. Crow had opened it. Her hand hovered over it, but Mrs. Crow's warning replayed in her mind. If you hear anything after midnight, don't answer." The clock on the desk shifted from 11:47 to 11:48. The knock came again, only once this time, quieter. Elise's pulse quickened. She took a step toward the door before stopping herself, turning instead toward the window. She pulled the curtain aside just enough to peek through. The yard was a shallow sea of mist. The lamplight at the road barely pierced it. Nothing moved, at least nothing she could see. But as she stood there, her breath fogging the glass, she thought she saw a darker patch in the mist, as if something large was standing still, staring up at her. Her stomach knotted. She let the curtain fall back into place. When she turned around, the door was open an inch. She froze. She had heard no creak, no metallic sigh of the hinges, just an open door where a closed one had been. The hallway beyond was empty, its carpet swallowing sound and shadow alike. Elise pushed the door closed, pressing until she felt the latch catch. This time she turned the key and kept it in her hand. Trying to ignore the prickle crawling up her spine, she sat at the desk and opened her notebook. Writing had always been her way of calming herself. Ordering her thoughts on paper made the chaos outside them easier to bear. The pen had barely touched the page when something brushed against the underside of the desk. It was the lightest of touches, like fingertips dragging slowly across the wood. She pulled her legs back instinctively, the chair scraping loudly. The sound from under the desk stopped. Her breathing was shallow now. She leaned down, peering into the shadowed space between the desk and the wall. Nothing. But then, faint and high-pitched, almost like a child's voice, came a whisper. "Room 5. The bulb above her flickered once. Then the knocking started again. This time from inside the room. The sound came from the wall to her left, near the head of the bed. Slow, deliberate knocks, spaced evenly. 1, 2, 3. Elise's throat tightened. She stared at the plaster, half expecting it to bulge outward with each impact. Her mind raced for explanations. Pipes, rats. The house settling. But pipes didn't knock in measured rhythm, and she doubted rats could sound so patient. The final knock landed, followed by silence so deep she could hear her own heartbeat. She stood slowly, the floor groaning under her weight, and pressed her ear to the wall. At first there was nothing. Then, so faint she almost convinced herself she imagined it, came the sound of breathing. Not hers. She staggered back, eyes locked on the wall, half expecting it to split open and reveal something on the other side. The desk lamp sputtered. This time the bulb didn't just flicker. It dimmed until the room was barely lit, a weak amber glow struggling against the dark. Elise crossed to her suitcase, fumbling for the flashlight she always traveled with. Her fingers closed around the cold metal cylinder, and she flicked it on. The beam sliced through the gloom, steady and reassuring, until she swept it toward the bed. The quilt she hadn't touched since arriving was pulled halfway to the floor, as though someone had been lying there and just gotten up. Her breath caught. She hadn't even sat on the bed since first inspecting the room. Before she could decide what to do, the sound came again, but this time from beneath the bed. A low, dragging shuffle, like something moving toward the footboard. Elise backed toward the door, the flashlight beam shaking in her grip. The key was still in her pocket, slick now with sweat. She turned it in the lock, her hands clumsy. Just as she was about to pull the door open, the mattress dipped. She turned, instinct overriding logic. The flashlight beam cut across the bed, landing on a shape that hadn't been there before. Pale, narrow fingers curling over the edge of the mattress, gripping it as if to pull something up from below. Her scream caught in her throat. The fingers slid back under the bed, vanishing into shadow. And then, complete silence. The quiet was worse, because now she could hear footsteps in the hallway, slow, approaching her door, and whoever it was humming. was the tune was faint but unmistakably human, a lilting, almost nursery-like melody that didn't belong in the oppressive air of the hallway. Elise stood frozen with her hand on the doorknob, her mind torn between locking it again and yanking it open to face whoever, or whatever, was out there. The humming stopped right outside her door. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. She leaned closer, straining to hear, and for a moment there was nothing. Then came the sound of slow, deliberate breathing on the other side, measured, patient, as though the person knew she was listening. A floorboard creaked. The breathing moved away, the footsteps receding down the hall until they faded entirely. Elise didn't move for what felt like minutes, only realizing she was gripping the doorknob so hard her knuckles ached when she finally let go. She turned the flashlight beam toward the bed again. Empty. She swept it across the desk, still as she'd left it. Yet the feeling of being watched clung to her like damp air. The curtains shifted. She spun, light catching the fabric as it swayed. The window was still closed, the latch firmly down, but the curtain's motion was slow, as if guided by more than the air. A shape emerged between them. It wasn't a person, at least not entirely. The outline was tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch just a little too long. The face, if it had one, was obscured in shadow. The shape tilted its head, a slow, unnatural angle, like a curious predator. Elise staggered back, the flashlight's beam wavering wildly. The thing didn't move. She could feel her pulse in her ears as she reached for the door again, but before she could pull it open, the curtains fell limp. The space by the window was empty. Only then did she realize the faint smudge on the inside of the glass, 4 long streaks, like the impression of fingers dragging slowly down. Her phone was in her bag. She snatched it up, thumb shaking as she tried to get a signal. The screen stubbornly displayed no service. From the hallway came another sound, faint at first, then sharper. The unmistakable scrape of something metallic dragging across the floor. And it was coming back toward her room. The metallic drag had a rhythm to it, slow and deliberate, punctuated by the soft thud of a footstep. It reminded Elise of a shovel being pulled across concrete, the sound vibrating in her teeth. She pressed her ear to the door, her breath shallow. The scrape was closer now, just beyond the bend in the hallway. Something about it was purposeful, almost ritualistic. Her mind screamed at her to stay put, but her body was already moving. She twisted the key in the lock, pulled the door open just enough to slip into the hallway, and shut it quietly behind her. The corridor was dark, except for the thin line of light leaking from beneath a door far at the end. Every framed photograph along the wall seemed to tilt toward her, their glassy eyes catching what little light there was. The scraping stopped. Elise froze, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. She could feel the stillness, as though the air itself were holding its breath. Then, slowly, the sound resumed, but this time it was behind her. She spun around. The hallway stretched into blackness in that direction, her flashlight beam trembling as it cut through the dark. Nothing, but the scrape came again, louder now and closer. She began moving toward the faintly lit door at the far end, forcing herself not to break into a run. The sound followed, matching her pace. Halfway down the hall, she passed a door that was ajar. Inside, she caught the glint of something metallic resting against the wall. She stopped just long enough to aim her flashlight inside. It was a long-handled spade, its blade stained dark. The scraping came again, but not from the hall. This time it came from inside the room she was looking into, from just beyond the reach of her light. She backed away, her shoulder hitting the opposite wall. That was when she saw the figure step forward into the beam. A man, or what used to be one, his clothes hanging in tatters, his skin the ashen gray of something pulled from deep earth. His eyes were cloudy, unfocused, but his lips curled into the suggestion of a grin as he lifted the spade. Elise ran. The hallway seemed to stretch, each step taking her nowhere, the lit door forever distant. Behind her, the scrape had become a sharp, uneven gallop. She hit the end of the corridor, slammed her hand against the door, and pushed it open, and found herself standing in a room that should not exist inside a boarding house. It was a field, a moonlit field of unmarked graves. Cold wind rushed past her, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something older, something that had been buried too long. The grass at her feet swayed, brushing against her ankles in a way that felt too deliberate, as though the ground itself was aware of her. The door behind her slammed shut with such force the sound echoed across the field. She spun, flashlight beam catching only empty air. No wall, no hallway, no sign the door had ever been there. The graves stretched in every direction, their mounds uneven and freshly disturbed in places. No headstones, no names, just lumps of soil and the occasional jut of a weathered root. Her beam landed on something pale protruding from the nearest mound. For a moment she thought it was bone, but as she stepped closer, she saw the unmistakable shape of a hand. The fingers were curled slightly, as though reaching toward the surface. She staggered back, her foot sinking into the damp earth. It gave under her weight, the ground swallowing her shoe nearly to the ankle. The soil was warm. A sound rippled across the field, soft at first, then growing in volume until it surrounded her. It wasn't the scrape of metal now. It was voices. Countless voices whispering at once, overlapping, forming a restless, wordless chorus. The hand twitched. Elise's flashlight flickered violently, the beam jumping from grave to grave, catching flashes of movement. An elbow breaking through soil, a knee forcing its way upward, fingers clawing at the air. All around her, the graves were waking. She turned in a full circle, searching for any sign of escape. In the far distance, past rows of stirring mounds, stood a single figure holding a lantern. The light was steady, warm, a golden promise in the darkness. Without thinking, she began moving toward it, her breath clouding in the cold air. The whispers grew louder, angrier, as though the field itself resented her leaving. A root snagged her foot, sending her sprawling. The flashlight flew from her hand, its beam spinning wildly before settling on a mound just ahead, one from which a face had begun to emerge. The skin was stretched too tightly over the skull, the mouth frozen in a silent scream. Eyes, glassy and wet, fixed directly on her. The whispers stopped all at once. Then, in a single, unified voice, the field spoke. "Stay." The word rolled through the night like a gust of wind that carried weight, pressing against her chest until it stole the air from her lungs. Elise scrambled backward, palms digging into the damp earth, her eyes locked on the emerging face. Its lips did not move, yet the voice reverberated inside her skull, as though the command had been placed directly into her thoughts. Stay. This time it was quieter, almost coaxing. The other graves had gone still, every half-buried hand and protruding limb frozen mid-motion. They were waiting. Elise's gaze shot toward the lantern in the distance. The figure holding it remained motionless, their light a fixed point in the vast darkness. She couldn't make out their features, only the outline of a long coat and the faint, deliberate sway of the lantern, side to side, side to side. The urge to obey the voice was so strong her muscles resisted when she tried to crawl away. Every movement felt like pushing through syrup, her thoughts growing sluggish, her will bleeding away. The hand from the nearest grave flexed, its fingernails black with soil. No, she told herself. She latched onto that word like a lifeline and forced herself onto her feet, wobbling unsteadily before breaking into a run. The whispering erupted again, but now it had turned to wails. Shapes lunged upward from the ground, torsos twisting unnaturally, jaws distending, fingers reaching. They didn't climb free of the earth so much as they were pushed from it, as though the soil was eager to give them up. Elise sprinted toward the lantern, her breath sharp and fast. Every step seemed to take her only inches closer. She glanced back just once, and wished she hadn't. The field was alive. Dozens, no, hundreds of figures were forcing themselves out of the ground, their limbs jerking with insect-like spasms. Faces blurred by dirt and decay turned toward her, and in unison they began to move. The figure with the lantern lifted it higher, and for the first time Elise saw their face. It was Mrs. Crow. Her expression was unreadable in the golden glow, but her free hand was raised in a gesture somewhere between a warning and a beckon. "Elise," Mrs. Crow's voice rang across the field, clear, steady, and loud enough to silence the wails for a heartbeat. "Run faster." Her legs obeyed before her mind caught up. The moment Mrs. Crow's voice cut through the night, something in the air shifted. The heaviness that had been pressing against Elise's chest lifted just enough for her to move freely. The ground grew uneven beneath her feet. Some mounds were soft, collapsing under her steps, while others were packed solid, forcing her to leap over them. She kept her eyes locked on the swaying lantern ahead, willing it to stay lit, to stay real. Behind her, the field erupted into chaos. The dead were no longer clawing at the air. They were chasing. Some dragged themselves by their arms. Others moved with a jerky, unnatural speed, their limbs bending in ways no living body could manage. Their chorus of moans and ragged breaths grew louder, a wall of sound driving her forward. Mrs. Crow was closer now, close enough that Elise could make out the sharp lines of her face and the thin curve of her mouth. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't afraid either. "Don't look back again," Mrs. Crow shouted. "They'll take more if you see their faces twice." Elise didn't know what that meant, but she obeyed. She fixed her gaze on the lantern, focusing on each swing of its light. Her lungs burned, her calves screamed, but she pushed harder. The distance between them closed to 12 feet, then 5. Mrs. Crow thrust the lantern toward her. "Here!" Elise reached for it, but the moment her fingers brushed the metal handle, the ground beneath her gave way. She dropped with a cry, plunging into cold, wet darkness. The soil closed over her head, filling her mouth with the bitter taste of iron and rot. She thrashed, clawing upward, but the more she moved, the deeper she seemed to sink. Something coiled around her ankle, fingers gripping hard, and yanked. Her scream was swallowed by the earth. Through the thin veil of dirt above her, she saw the lantern light swing wildly, then vanish entirely, as though it had been snuffed out. And in the suffocating dark, something whispered in her ear, close enough that its breath brushed her skin. "You're ours now." The grip around her ankle tightened, cold and inhumanly strong, pulling her deeper into the soil. Elise kicked wildly, her heels striking something soft that gave way with a sickening crunch. The fingers still slipped for a moment, just enough for her to claw upward, her hands breaking into a pocket of air. She gasped, sucking in the damp night. The earth clung to her like a living thing, heavy and unyielding, as if reluctant to let her go. Every movement was a battle, her arms trembling from the strain. Somewhere above, muffled but unmistakable, came Mrs. Crow's voice. "Elise, grab my hand." She forced her head up, blinking through clumps of dirt. The lantern's light returned, swaying frantically, and beside it was Mrs. Crow's outstretched arm, pale against the black sky. Elise lunged for it, just as the fingers around her ankle returned. More of them this time. They wrapped her other leg, then her calves, pulling in a rhythm as if several things beneath the soil were working together to drag her under. She caught Mrs. Crow's wrist. The older woman's grip was shockingly strong, yanking her up inch by inch. Elise felt the cold hands clawing at her legs, nails biting into her skin through her jeans. "They can't take you if I get you past the line," Mrs. Crow gritted out, bracing herself. "What line?" Elise gasped, coughing on dirt. "You'll see." The moment Mrs. Crow dragged her free of the soil, the world changed. The air shifted from icy and damp to still and dry, and the whispering, ever present since the first grave, vanished. Elise collapsed onto firm, frost-stiffened grass. She looked behind her, expecting to see the graves again. Instead, there was nothing but the narrow hallway of the boarding house, dimly lit and lined with those same crooked photographs. Her heart lurched. The field was gone. Mrs. Crow still held her arm, breathing heavily but otherwise composed. "You should not have opened that door." Elise stared, still trying to catch her breath. That wasn't possible." Mrs. Crow's expression didn't change. "Marrow House makes many things possible. Now, go back to your room and stay there." Before Elise could ask another question, Mrs. Crow turned and walked away, the lantern's glow shrinking until it vanished entirely, leaving Elise alone in the hallway. Somewhere upstairs, a door creaked open on its own. The sound was faint but deliberate, the slow groan of old hinges under strain. Elise's pulse hadn't yet returned to normal, and now it spiked again. She turned toward the staircase, her flashlight beam trembling over the banister's smooth, worn wood. The house was silent except for that single, open-ended creak, as though the door upstairs hadn't just been opened but was still opening, inch by inch. Elise swallowed hard. Every instinct screamed for her to retreat to her room and lock the door. But her room was upstairs. She took the first step, the wood bending under her weight with a hollow sigh. The second step followed, then the third. The creak above stopped, replaced by the soft, almost imperceptible sound of something moving on the carpeted hallway. A shuffle, then stillness. When she reached the landing, she froze. Halfway down the hall, room 7's door stood wide open. She could see only darkness inside, thick and impenetrable even under the sweep of her flashlight. "Mrs. Crow?" Elise called softly, though she already knew there would be no answer. Something inside room 7 shifted, a small, quick sound, like bare feet repositioning on carpet. Her hand tightened around the flashlight. She told herself she would just shut the door and get to her own room. She took a step toward it, then another. Halfway there, she noticed something on the floor just outside the open doorway. A line of soil, thin but deliberate, trailing out into the hallway. Her stomach turned. The trail ended abruptly, as though whatever had left it had stopped, or was still standing there, unseen. She aimed her flashlight at the darkness inside room 7. For a moment, she thought it was truly empty. Then a shape emerged, a figure crouched in the far corner, its head bowed low, arms wrapped tightly around its legs. Its skin was the color of damp clay, its hair stringy and wet-looking, as though it had just clawed its way from the ground. Slowly, the head lifted. The face was wrong, not decomposed, not monstrous, but eerily familiar. It was her own. "Elise," the thing whispered in her exact voice, smiling in a way she never had. The smile widened, stretching her own lips into something predatory, like a mask worn too long. Its eyes, her eyes, were glassy, reflecting the flashlight's beam, but showing no warmth, no humanity. Elise stumbled back, her shoulder hitting the hallway wall. What are you?" The thing tilted its head, a perfect imitation of her nervous habit. "I'm the one who stays," it said, her own voice curling around the words like smoke. "The one who doesn't run when they call." Elise's skin prickled. "I didn't," the other her interrupted with a low chuckle. "You almost did. You almost listened. But she pulled you back. She always pulls them back." "Mrs. Crow?" Elise whispered. The thing's smile faltered, just slightly. "She thinks she owns the house. She doesn't." The words were heavy, too heavy, as though they carried more than simple meaning. Elise realized she was inching backward without thinking, her flashlight beam shaking wildly across the floor. The other Elise unfolded from its crouch. It moved wrong, too fluid in some places, too stiff in others. When it stepped into the doorway, the line of soil shifted beneath its bare feet. "Room 5, it said, and now the voice was layered, hers and something deeper, something that scraped along the edges of hearing. "That's where you belong." Elise's grip on the flashlight tightened. "I'm not going back in there." The thing's smile returned, this time sharper. "Then you'll go somewhere worse." Before Elise could react, the lights in the hallway went out all at once. In the blackness, she heard her own voice, dozens of versions of it, whispering her name from every direction. "Elise." The name slid across her skin like a cold hand, whispered from far away and directly in her ear at the same time. The darkness was absolute. Her flashlight flickered once, then went dead. The beam strangled before it could cut through the black. Her breaths came fast, shallow. She fumbled with the flashlight, smacking it against her palm, but the voices drowned out her own movements. "Elise. Elise. Elise." Each repetition sounded more familiar, as though pieces of her own memories had been stitched into the words, the tone she used when calling her own name into an empty apartment, the half-asleep mutter she made in mirrors. Something brushed past her in the dark. Not air, not fabric. Skin. Warm, dry, and slow. She bolted sideways, hands out, fingertips grazing the wall. The texture of old wallpaper grounded her for half a heartbeat before she realized it felt wrong. The pattern was moving beneath her touch, curling away from her fingers as if alive. "Elise." The voices now overlapped with laughter, thin, breathless, and rising in pitch until it was almost a scream. She forced herself forward, one hand dragging along the wall, the other clutching the dead flashlight like a weapon. Her eyes began to adjust, but the dark was too deep, too thick to yield much. Then she felt it, the faintest glow ahead, a shape in the black. It was a door. Relief flooded her until she noticed the outline of someone standing in front of it. The figure was still, its head tilted, watching her. "Elise," it said. Not a whisper this time, but a low, steady voice. She recognized it instantly. Mrs. Crow. But as the glow sharpened, Elise saw her face, and it was not the same woman who'd pulled her from the field. This face was younger, the skin unlined, the eyes too bright. The smile was wide and wrong. "Come," the young Mrs. Crow said, extending a hand. "It's your turn to see where the house begins." Elise didn't take the hand. Every instinct screamed that if she touched it, she wouldn't be able to pull away. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she said, her voice shaking but steady enough to sound like defiance. The younger Mrs. Crow tilted her head, the same small bird-like motion Elise had seen in the figure at the window. "You already have. You stepped through the first door the moment you arrived. All the rest are just rooms." Her fingers curled inward, beckoning. "You'll like this one. It's quiet there. You don't have to keep running." Behind Elise, the whispering voices shifted tone, softer now, as though agreeing with the woman, coaxing her forward. She could almost hear words inside the murmurs. "Rest. Stay. Stop fighting." "I want to leave the house," Elise said, forcing the words past the growing weight in her chest. The younger Mrs. Crow's smile faltered. For a flicker of a second, her eyes darkened, as if the pupils had swallowed the irises whole. "The house doesn't let you leave. It lets you change." She stepped aside from the glowing doorway. "Come see. If you don't like it, you can choose another room. Some are even worse, but you might get lucky." Elise's throat tightened. Lucky didn't sound like freedom. It sounded like survival. The glow from the doorway pulsed faintly, like a slow heartbeat, spilling pale light onto the floor. Inside, she could see only a sliver of what waited, a narrow, winding staircase that seemed to spiral both up and down at once. Behind her, something shifted in the dark. Heavy, slow footsteps approached, too heavy for a living person. "You can go with them," the younger Mrs. Crow said softly, "or you can go with me." A cold breath brushed Elise's neck. Whatever was behind her had stopped inches away. Her choice had to be made now. The air pressed in on her from both directions. Ahead, the pale glow of the impossible staircase beckoned with its slow, steady pulse. Behind, the presence loomed, tall, unmoving, its breath like air pulled from an open grave. Elise's fingers clenched tighter around the dead flashlight. "What's at the bottom?" she asked, nodding toward the staircase. The younger Mrs. Crow's smile returned, faint and knowing. "Not the bottom that matters, dear. It's the middle. That's where you start remembering what you were before you walked in." "I don't want to remember anything," Elise said. "Then perhaps you should turn around," Mrs. Crow said, her voice syrupy now, coaxing. "They'll take your will first. After that, it's easier." The thing behind her shifted its weight. Elise heard the faint crack of joints moving, too slow, too deliberate to be human. The smell of soil thickened until it coated her tongue. The glow from the doorway pulsed again. This time she noticed the shadows it cast on the walls didn't match her own outline. They were longer, bent as if something just out of sight were moving down the staircase. The voices in the dark began whispering again, but now they weren't calling her name. They were chanting something low and rhythmic, words she couldn't understand but felt deep in her bones. Her knees trembled as the sound wrapped around her mind like vines. Her choices were clear: step into the stairwell or surrender to whatever stood behind her. She moved. One foot crossed the threshold into the glow. The moment it touched the first step, a violent rush of air surged past her, as though the darkness itself had tried to drag her back. She stumbled forward, both feet landing on the narrow stair. The younger Mrs. Crow stepped in after her, the door swinging shut without a sound. The glow intensified and the stairs began to move, not downward, not upward, but in a slow, spiraling drift, carrying them deeper into a place Elise knew wasn't anywhere in the world she'd come from. The staircase didn't creak or sway like something built from wood. It hummed faintly underfoot, each step giving just slightly, like the surface of a drum. The glow that lit the way didn't come from above or below. It seemed to emanate from the air itself, casting everything in an unnatural pallor. Elise gripped the railing, though it felt wrong under her palm, smooth yet somehow warm, as though it had a pulse. Mrs. Crow moved ahead without looking back, her feet making no sound. "Don't count the steps," she said suddenly. "It notices when you count." "What notices?" Elise asked, her voice tight. "You'll know if you do it," Mrs. Crow replied, as if that were enough. The spiral narrowed as they went, the walls tightening, the hum growing louder. Elise risked a glance over the edge of the stairwell, but there was no central column, no bottom, only more spiraling stairs vanishing into a haze that bent and swirled like fog stirred by something massive moving within it. "How far does this go?" Elise asked. "Farther than you," Mrs. Crow said without pause. The steps began to soften under Elise's feet, sinking slightly when she stepped, as though she were walking on thick, stretched fabric. She tried to keep her focus on the back of Mrs. Crow's head, but her eyes were drawn to the walls. The glow was stronger here, revealing that the surface wasn't wood or stone. It was painted, and not with patterns, with faces. They were subtle at first, just the curve of an eyelid, the suggestion of a mouth. But as the glow shifted, more appeared. Dozens, then hundreds pressed into the walls like something beneath the surface trying to get out. Their expressions were all the same, straining, mouths open in silent screams. Elise tore her gaze away and found Mrs. Crow watching her, her head tilted ever so slightly. "They're only dangerous if you touch them," she said. From below, a sound rose through the spiral. Slow, scraping footsteps, and they were getting closer. The sound was steady, deliberate, each footfall followed by the faint drag of something heavy along the stairs. Elise felt the vibration through the strange, drum-like steps, a dull thud that traveled up her legs. She glanced over the edge again, but the haze below swallowed everything beyond a few spirals down. The footsteps grew louder, joined by a faint metallic clink, like a loose chain brushing against metal. "Keep moving," Mrs. Crow said without turning around. "What is it?" Elise asked. "The house doesn't like when someone leaves their room," Mrs. Crow replied, "and it always sends someone to fetch them." A cold shiver slid down Elise's spine. "Fetch, like to take back?" Mrs. Crow didn't answer. The humming of the stairs deepened in pitch, vibrating in her bones. Elise quickened her pace to match Mrs. Crow's, but the spiral was tightening, the rail pressing close to her side. The walls were so near now that the painted faces brushed her shoulders if she wasn't careful. The steps below grew heavier, faster. Whoever, or whatever, it was gaining. A sudden thunk rang out from beneath, sharp and final, as if a foot had struck the railing hard. Elise flinched. She risked one last glance downward and saw movement through the haze. At first it looked like a person, but their proportions were wrong. The arms were too long, swinging low enough that the fingertips nearly brushed the steps below them. Their head hung forward, hair concealing their face, and in one hand they dragged a long, hooked pole that scraped against the railing with every step. It stopped mid-spiral and lifted its head. Though Elise couldn't see the face clearly, she felt it looking at her, recognition prickling across her skin. "Elise," it said in a deep, warped echo of her own voice. Mrs. Crow snapped her head toward her. "Don't answer it." The thing began climbing faster and climbing. The sound was steady, deliberate, each footfall followed by the faint drag of something heavy along the stairs. Elise felt the vibration through the strange drum-like steps, a dull thud that traveled up her legs. She glanced over the edge again, but the haze below swallowed everything beyond a few spirals down. The footsteps grew louder, joined by a faint metallic clink, like a loose chain brushing against metal. "Keep moving," Mrs. Crow said without turning around. "What is it?" Elise asked. "The house doesn't like when someone leaves their room," Mrs. Crow replied, "and it always sends someone to fetch them." A cold shiver slid down Elise's spine. "Fetch, like to take back?" Mrs. Crow didn't answer. The humming of the stairs deepened in pitch, vibrating in her bones. Elise quickened her pace to match Mrs. Crow's, but the spiral was tightening, the rail pressing close to her side. The walls were so near now that the painted faces brushed her shoulders if she wasn't careful. The steps below grew heavier, faster. Whoever, or whatever, it was gaining. A sudden thunk rang out from beneath, sharp and final, as if a foot had struck the railing hard. Elise flinched. She risked one last glance downward and saw movement through the haze. At first it looked like a person, but their proportions were wrong. The arms were too long, swinging low enough that the fingertips nearly brushed the steps below them. Their head hung forward, hair concealing their face, and in one hand they dragged a long, hooked pole that scraped against the railing with every step. It stopped mid-spiral and lifted its head. Though Elise couldn't see the face clearly, she felt it looking at her, recognition prickling across her skin. "Elise," it said in a deep, warped echo of her own voice. Mrs. Crow snapped her head toward her. "Don't answer it." The thing began climbing faster. Dozens of mirrors lined the walls, each one framed in tarnished silver and warped with age. Some stood taller than she was. Others were small, barely larger than a hand, yet all of them reflected her image with unnatural clarity. Elise's reflection stared back at her from every angle, but it wasn't synchronized. In the nearest mirror, she blinked a moment too late. In another, she shifted her weight even though she stood still. Mrs. Crow was nowhere in sight. Elise turned in a slow circle, her pulse thundering in her ears. The floor beneath her was smooth and black, reflecting the mirrors so perfectly that it felt as though she were standing in an endless void with infinite versions of herself. One of the reflections smiled. Elise froze. She hadn't moved her mouth. The smiling reflection was two mirrors to her left, its head tilted slightly. Then, without warning, it stepped forward, out of sync with her entirely, and pressed a hand against the glass from the inside. A faint crack spidered outward where its palm touched. Another reflection began to move on its own, this one directly behind her in a tall, narrow frame. She spun to face it, but her real reflection didn't meet her gaze. It was looking at something behind her. Cold dread knotted in her stomach. Slowly, she turned her head. The mirror she had first noticed, the one with the smile, was empty. Glass crunched underfoot. She looked down. A long crack had formed on the floor's reflective surface, running straight between her feet, as though something beneath it were pushing to get through. Her distorted reflections in the broken glass began mouthing words she couldn't hear. Then one voice broke through, whispering so close it might have been inside her ear. "You don't belong out there." The whisper clung to her like damp breath, curling into the folds of her mind before she could shake it off. Every reflection in the room, hundreds of Elises, was now speaking in unison, their mouths moving soundlessly except for the one voice that had found its way through. "You belong in here." Elise backed away, but there was no direction to choose that didn't put her closer to another mirror. Some versions of her pressed their palms to the glass, others stood motionless with wide, expectant eyes. She spotted the tall, narrow mirror from before, the one where her reflection had been looking behind her. Now that version of her was leaning forward, both hands flat on the glass, its lips stretched in a grin so wide it looked painful. "Come closer," it mouthed. The crack in the black floor deepened with a sharp, wet pop. A jagged piece of the surface shifted upward, and through the gap she saw movement. Pale, grasping fingers pushing from below. Her breath hitched. She turned toward the only mirror that didn't seem to be moving on its own. A small, oval one, low on the far wall. In it, her reflection stood perfectly still, matching her posture exactly. She inched toward it, avoiding the spiderweb cracks on the floor. The moment she reached for the frame, the glass rippled. Her reflection leaned forward and whispered, "Run." Every other version of her in the room slammed their hands against the glass at once. The sound was deafening, like shattering ice. But no mirror actually broke. Instead, the air around her thickened, and the fingers from the floor pushed further through, scraping the black surface as they reached for her ankles. The oval mirror surface rippled again, this time wide enough to see beyond it. It wasn't reflecting the mirror room anymore. It showed a long, dim hallway lined with doors, and at the far end of that hallway, Mrs. Crow stood waiting. Mrs. Crow's figure was small at the far end, her silhouette barely lit by a faint amber glow, like the lantern she'd carried in the field. She didn't move, didn't call to Elise, but the way she stood, angled toward the mirror, made it clear she was waiting. The black floor beneath Elise shuddered. The fingers breaking through were no longer just fingers. They were hands now, wrists, and the beginnings of forearms, all pale as clay and slick with some dark fluid that dripped onto the surface and vanished into the cracks. The other reflections were pressing harder against their glass prisons, some of them opening their mouths impossibly wide. The oval mirror rippled again. The image of the hallway seemed closer, as though it were trying to pull her in. "Elise," one of the rogue reflections hissed, its voice thick and wet, "you won't like what's behind those doors." Another voice joined in, this one sounding exactly like her own mother's. "Stay where it's safe." The voices layered, Dozens of tones, both hers and not hers, urging her to stay, promising comfort in exchange for obedience. But the hallway, long, narrow, and quiet, seemed almost normal compared to the chaos around her. The floor gave another violent tremor. A pale, long-fingered hand shot up through the widening gap, grabbing her ankle with bone-snapping force. Pain jolted through her leg, and she cried out, slamming the dead flashlight down on the knuckles until they let go. She didn't think. She lunged for the oval mirror. The glass didn't resist. It yielded like the surface of a pond, cool and fluid, and her hand vanished inside. The pull was immediate, stronger than anything she could have resisted. She was yanked forward, tumbling through the glass, and landed hard on her hands and knees in the hallway from the vision. When she looked up, Mrs. Crow was only a few feet away. "Better," Mrs. Crow said softly, "but you should know. You've skipped ahead. Elise staggered to her feet, the echo of the mirror room still ringing in her ears. "Skipped ahead?" she asked, her voice raw. Mrs. Crow's expression was unreadable. "The house has an order. Rooms you were meant to see, things you were meant to learn before others. You've missed some." She tilted her head slightly. "That comes with risks." The hallway stretched in both directions, lined with identical doors, each one painted the same dull gray. There were no numbers, no signs, just endless symmetry. The air was stale, and the single light above them buzzed faintly. "What's behind them?" Elise asked. "That depends," Mrs. Crow said. "Some are empty, some aren't. Some have been waiting for you a very long time." A faint rhythmic thump echoed down the hall, soft enough that it might have been her imagination. Mrs. Crow glanced toward it. "And some shouldn't be opened at all." The thump came again, louder now. Elise turned her head, trying to pinpoint which door it came from, but it seemed to bounce between them, never landing on one for long. Mrs. Crow stepped past her and began walking, her shoes silent on the floor. "Stay close. The hallway likes to change when it's only got one set of footsteps to follow." They passed the first door. Elise thought she saw the handle twitch, just a small metallic shiver as they moved by. The next door had faint scratches along the bottom, deep enough to expose raw wood beneath the paint. The thumping stopped. A whisper bled from one of the doors ahead, low, wet, almost intimate. Elise froze, straining to hear. It said her name. Twice. Mrs. Crow didn't stop walking. "Don't answer it," she murmured. Something knocked back from inside the nearest door, 3 slow, deliberate raps. The sound was exactly like the knock she'd heard her first night in room 5. The 3 knocks reverberated down the hallway, low and patient, as though whatever was inside knew she was already listening. Elise's throat tightened. "It's the same," she whispered, barely aware she'd spoken. "From my room, the first night." Mrs. Crow didn't even glance back. The house likes to reuse its tricks. She stepped past another door, her gaze fixed straight ahead. "The question is whether you've learned not to fall for them." Elise hesitated. The urge to reach for the handle was sudden, almost overwhelming, like the impulse to glance over your shoulder when someone's watching. She imagined the cold brass under her fingers, the slow swing of the door. A soft scrape joined the memory of the knock, the sound of something dragging itself closer from the other side. Her breath quickened. "What's in there?" "Not your concern," Mrs. Crow said, sharper now. "And not your door." Elise tore her eyes from it, forcing herself to follow. The hallway felt longer now, each stretch between doors pulling into impossible distances. The buzzing light above them dimmed slightly with every step. When they passed the next door, Elise thought she heard breathing. Not deep, not labored, just steady and close, as if someone were standing with their ear pressed to the other side. Mrs. Crow's pace never changed, but her voice lowered. "You can't keep skipping. The house notices." "I didn't mean to," Elise muttered. "No one means to." They reached a corner where the hallway split. Mrs. Crow paused, tilting her head in the direction of the left-hand path. The air there was heavier, almost damp. From somewhere far down, it came a faint metallic rattle, like a chain brushing the floor. She turned to Elise. "We go right." But before they could take a single step, a door to their left clicked open. Only a sliver, just enough for Elise to see the pale, narrow fingers curling around the edge. The fingers tightened their grip on the edge of the door, the pale knuckles flexing as though testing the weight of the wood. They didn't move forward, didn't reveal the rest of what they belonged to, just held the door in place, half open, half shut, like an invitation. Elise's stomach clenched. "It's not. No," Mrs. Crow interrupted, her voice like a snapped thread. "It's not for you." But the air shifted, subtle, almost like the draft of a hidden vent, and with it came a scent Elise recognized instantly. Damp earth, sharp and metallic, the smell of the graves in the field. The fingers twitched. "Elise," a voice whispered from behind the doorframe. Her voice. It wasn't loud, but the sound went straight through her, bypassing reason, bypassing fear. It was the voice she heard in the mirror room, the one that had smiled wrong. Mrs. Crow stepped between Elise and the door, her shadow cutting across the pale knuckles. "Close your eyes." "What?" "Close them now." Elise obeyed, clamping her eyes shut so tightly she saw bursts of red behind her lids. She heard the faint click of the door shutting, followed by a single quiet word from Mrs. Crow that she didn't recognize. Something sharp and guttural, spoken like it was meant to cut. When Elise opened her eyes, the door was gone. Not shut, not moved. Gone. The wall was smooth and unbroken where it had been seconds before. Her voice trembled. "Where did it go?" Mrs. Crow adjusted her sleeve, her tone even. "Some doors close, others are removed." They turned down the right-hand hallway, the air cooler here, the light less harsh. Elise glanced over her shoulder once, just once, and saw that in the place where the door had been, the wall now bulged outward, as if something behind it were pressing to get out. The chain rattle from the other hallway had stopped, and from far ahead, somewhere down the path they'd chosen, came a new sound, the faint but unmistakable ringing of a small bell. The sound was delicate, almost polite, a gentle ting-ting-ting that echoed faintly along the corridor. Each ring seemed perfectly timed, neither rushed nor slow, as though whoever held the bell wanted her to hear it long before she saw them. Mrs. Crow didn't stop walking, but her shoulders stiffened. "Stay close. Do not let go of my sleeve." Elise obeyed, fingers curling into the coarse fabric. "What is it?" she whispered. "A collar," Mrs. Crow said, her voice low. "They're persistent." The corridor stretched on, the light above flickering in a slow, uneasy rhythm that seemed to match the bell's chime. The air grew colder the farther they went, until Elise could see the faint mist of her own breath. The ringing grew louder, still polite, still steady, but with a new weight to it, like it was inside her head as much as in the hallway. They rounded a bend, and Elise froze. A figure stood in the middle of the hallway facing them. It was tall, dressed in a long, dark coat that nearly touched the floor. Its head was bent, and from one skeletal hand dangled a small silver bell, swaying gently back and forth. The figure's face was hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, but Elise could see the pale curve of its jaw. Too pale, like bone bleached under the sun. The bell chimed again, and the sound seemed to pull at her chest, a strange compulsion rising in her to step forward, to see its face. She swayed before realizing it, her grip on Mrs. Crow's sleeve loosening. The older woman's voice cut through the haze, sharp, commanding. Look at me, not at it." Elise tore her eyes away from the figure, forcing herself to focus on the sharp lines of Mrs. Crow's face. The ringing stopped. The silence was worse. When she risked a glance back, the figure was gone. Mrs. Crow's mouth was a thin line. "It knows you now," she said. From somewhere far behind them, the bell chimed once more. This time it sounded closer than it should have. The single chime hung in the air far too long, as if the sound itself refused to fade. Elise's grip on Mrs. Crow's sleeve tightened again, her fingers cold despite the heat building in her chest. "We have to move faster," Mrs. Crow said. "It won't stop until it sees your face." The thought alone made Elise's skin crawl. "And if it does? You'll open a door you didn't mean to," Mrs. Crow said simply, glancing over her shoulder without breaking stride. "And you won't be the one walking back out." The hallway seemed to bend subtly underfoot, as though the floor had grown softer in places, dipping just enough to make her uneasy. Every few steps, Elise swore she felt the faintest vibration beneath her shoes, like a pulse. The bell rang again. This time it wasn't behind them, it was ahead. Mrs. Crow stopped, her head tilted slightly, listening. Then she took a slow step forward. "It's not supposed to do that," she muttered under her breath. The next chime was louder, sharper. Elise's vision wavered at the edges, the air shimmering faintly like heat on asphalt. She realized the hallway ahead was wrong. The light was softer, tinged gold instead of the flat, cold white overhead. The doors on either side had changed, their dull gray now replaced by deep, polished wood. And then, movement. The caller emerged from one of the wooden doors. Its coat swayed with the slow, deliberate rhythm of its steps, the bell dangling casually from its skeletal hand. This close, Elise could see the long, thin fingers wrapped around the handle, the skin stretched tight over the bones. It stopped just far enough away for her to make out the lower half of its face, the suggestion of a smile, faint and knowing. The bell chimed again. Her knees buckled. She caught herself on the wall, but the wood beneath her palm was warm, almost feverish. The door beside her shuddered once. "Elise," the caller said. Its voice was the sound of metal sliding across stone. "You've been walking the wrong way." The voice lodged deep in her chest, vibrating in a way words shouldn't. Elise's hand jerked back from the warm wood as if it had burned her. Mrs. Crow stepped between them, her body a thin barrier, but her tone was sharp enough to cut. "You're not hers." The caller tilted its head. The faint smile widened, revealing teeth too uniform, too smooth, like carved porcelain. "She's closer than you think. All it takes is one door." The bell swayed again, its chime low and almost playful. The door beside Elise trembled once more. This time a hairline crack appeared at the center, light bleeding through as though something bright waited on the other side. The warmth radiating from it turned almost comforting. Almost. Elise's thoughts fuzzed, her mind drifting toward the memory of standing at her own apartment door, keys in hand, the familiar scent of home just beyond. She could swear she smelled it now. Laundry detergent, coffee grounds, rain on the windowsill. Mrs. Crow's voice snapped through the haze. "Don't trust the smell. The house borrows from you." The bell chimed again. The warmth from the door surged, coaxing her hand forward without permission. She was an inch from touching the crack when Mrs. Crow seized her wrist. "Elise, look at me." She obeyed, breath shaking. The caller didn't move, but the gold-tinged light from the wooden doors began to dim, leaking away as if drained. The smile faded from its face. "She'll tire of protecting you," it said. "When she does, I'll be waiting." Mrs. Crow didn't reply. She just pulled Elise down the hall, pace quickening until the polished wood gave way to dull gray again, the air colder, the buzz of the overhead lights returning. Only when the bell's echo had finally died did Mrs. Crow release her wrist. "You nearly let it take you," she said. "I didn't mean to." "You think anyone means to?" Her voice was softer now, but not kind. "Come on. You're running out of safe rooms." They turned a corner, and at the end of the next stretch stood a door unlike the others. Wide, arched, painted a deep bleeding red. The red paint glistened as though it had been applied moments ago, still wet in places. The air around it felt warmer, heavier, each breath Elise took carrying the faint copper tang of blood. Mrs. Crow slowed, her eyes narrowing. "We weren't meant to come this way." Lisa's pulse kicked up. "Then let's turn around." "No," Mrs. Crow interrupted, gaze fixed on the door. "Once you've seen it, you can't ignore it. The house will only put it somewhere else, and each time it does, it opens wider." Elise swallowed hard. "What's behind it?" Mrs. Crow's expression didn't change, but her tone was low and clipped. "The part that remembers." The closer they came, the more Elise realized the red wasn't just paint. Faint impressions were worked into the surface, shapes, curves, outlines of faces like the ones she'd seen pressed into the spiral staircase walls. Except these faces were different. They were hers, dozens of them, each with a slightly different expression: fear, exhaustion, resignation. One near the bottom had eyes closed, lips parted as though whispering. Another stared directly at her with a look that made her stomach twist. Relief. Mrs. Crow stopped a few feet away. "If you touch it, it will know which one you are." The door pulsed, just slightly, like the faint expansion of a held breath. Elise took an involuntary step back. "We can't go in," she said. "We don't have to," Mrs. Crow replied, but her eyes stayed on the door. "We just have to pass it without answering." A sound came from the other side, slow at first, then sharper. Knuckles against wood, 3 knocks, the same patient rhythm from room 5. Elise's skin crawled. She forced herself to turn away, but the moment her gaze left the door, the knocking grew louder, closer, like the sound was moving from behind it to directly over her shoulder. She froze. "That's not possible," she whispered. "It's following you," Mrs. Crow said. "Walk." Elise took a step, then another, the knocks keeping perfect pace beside her. The sound didn't fade until they passed the far wall, and found themselves in a place that wasn't the hallway at all. It was a vast dining room, lit by a single flickering chandelier. The chandelier swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. Its crystal pendants caught the light in uneven flashes, throwing warped shapes across the walls. The table beneath it stretched far longer than seemed possible, at least 50 feet, its dark surface polished to a mirror sheen. Every chair was occupied. Elise's breath hitched. At first she thought they were mannequins, the stillness too complete. But then she saw the faint rise and fall of chests, the minute tremor of fingers resting on the tabletop. None of them looked at her. Their heads were bowed, as if in prayer or shame. Mrs. Crow stepped inside without hesitation, her shoes clicking softly against the floor. "Don't touch them," she said. "Who are they?" Elise asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Guests," Mrs. Crow replied. "Some from long before you, some not so long ago." Elise moved cautiously along the wall, eyes scanning the frozen figures. Their clothing was mismatched and from different eras. Lace collars beside modern t-shirts, suits that might have been a century old beside jeans frayed at the knees. The air here was stifling, thick with a faint scent of candle wax and something sour beneath it. One of the guests shifted suddenly, their head twitching up just far enough for Elise to catch a glimpse of their face. It was her. Not exactly, this version of her was paler, with dark shadows beneath the eyes and lips tinged blue. The mouth opened slowly, like cracking ice. and whispered, "Sit down." Elise stumbled back, heart hammering. The other guests didn't move, but she felt dozens of unseen eyes turn toward her all at once. Mrs. Crow's voice cut through the tension, firmer now. "Ignore them. Keep walking." Elise tore her gaze from the table and focused on the far end of the room, where a tall set of double doors waited, their brass handles tarnished with age. But as they drew closer, a deep groan rolled through the space, low, resonant, and coming from the table itself. The polished surface began to ripple, as though something massive was moving just beneath it. The ripple spread outward in slow waves, warping the reflections of the chandelier until the light looked like it was being dragged down into deep water. The guests didn't react. Their heads remained bowed, hands motionless on the table. "Elise," Mrs. Crow said, her voice low but urgent, "don't stop walking." Elise's feet felt glued to the floor, her attention locked on the movement under the polished surface. The ripple shifted again, this time accompanied by a faint thump, as though something had struck the underside of the wood from within. Another thump, louder. The guest who wore her face turned its head just enough to look at her fully. Its eyes were glazed, but its lips curved upward into a slow, deliberate smile. "You're almost here," it whispered. The table groaned again, the ripple becoming a swell. The crystal pendants above clinked together as if the air itself was being pulled toward that central point. "Elise," Mrs. Crow repeated, sharper now. The swell broke. A pale hand shot up from the table's surface, fingers impossibly long, gripping the wood hard enough to leave deep indentations. The surface around it dented inward like soft clay, and a second hand followed, then the curve of a head pressing up from beneath. The wood didn't break. It stretched, bending around the emerging shape like skin around a bone. The guests began to hum, low and in unison, the sound vibrating in Elise's teeth. "Don't look at it," Mrs. Crow ordered. "The moment you see its face." The rest of her warning was drowned out by a wet, tearing sound as the thing pushed further through, its neck impossibly long, its movements jerky and insect-like. Elise stumbled backward, her eyes darting toward the double doors. They were still far, but not impossibly far, until the floor shifted beneath her feet. The room had grown longer. The distance to the double doors stretched with each blink, the brass handles shrinking into the far haze like retreating stars. Elise's chest tightened as the chandelier swaying slowed, its crystals now barely trembling despite the oppressive hum filling the room. The thing emerging from the table had pushed itself farther through, its head still bent low, the crown of its skull brushing the underside of the chandelier. Its skin was stretched thin, almost translucent, and beneath it she could see something pulsing, beating in an uneven rhythm. The guests' humming deepened, some opening their mouths wider than seemed possible. The sound was pulling at her, not just her body, but her memory. Faces and places flickered in her mind. The corner cafe near her old apartment, the way her father looked the last time she saw him, the chipped mug she always kept by the sink. They felt farther away now, like details from a dream she'd already begun to lose. "Elise," Mrs. Crow's voice sliced through the haze, sharp enough to make her stumble forward. "Eyes on the door, nothing else." Elise fixed her gaze on the shrinking brass handles and began to run. The floor underfoot seemed to shift like loose sand, slowing her, but each step felt like it cost the room something. Its hum faltered, its swell of sound breaking. The thing on the table moved for the first time. It lifted its head. Elise didn't see its face, she couldn't, but she felt the weight of its gaze slam into her back, heavy and invasive, as though it was taking stock of every bone, every breath. The hum shifted, no longer deep, but almost a growl. The double doors were close enough now that she could make out the tarnished details on the handles. Mrs. Crow reached them first, her hand curling around the brass. She threw one side open, the hinges shrieking. "Elise, now!" She sprinted the last few steps, crossing the threshold just as something long and cold brushed the back of her neck. The doors slammed shut behind her. They were in darkness again. The slam of the doors left a hollow echo that seemed to roll on far too long, bouncing through the pitch-black space they had entered. Elise's breathing was ragged, loud in her own ears, the only proof she was still here. She couldn't see Mrs. Crow. "Don't move," came the older woman's voice, close but not close enough to touch. "The floor changes shape until it knows where you'll step." Elise froze, forcing herself to still every muscle. Her body screamed to turn on the flashlight, but the dead weight of it in her hand reminded her it hadn't worked since the mirror room. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice swallowed almost instantly by the dark. "You'd call it a passage," Mrs. Crow replied, "but the house uses it for sorting." A faint sound drifted in from the black, like pebbles skittering across a smooth surface. Then a second sound, heavier, wet, as if something large and soft was shifting nearby. "Something's in here," Elise whispered. "There's always something in here," Mrs. Crow said flatly. The skittering drew closer, then stopped. The wet sound followed, a dragging motion that made Elise's skin crawl, and then, just in front of her, came a sharp, clean click, like a lock snapping into place. A dim light flared to life somewhere high above, revealing only a few feet of the space around them. The floor was wrong. No wood, no carpet, just a stretched, leathery surface that shifted subtly under their weight. In the faint glow, Elise could finally see Mrs. Crow, her face more tense than she'd yet seen it. "We walk until the light goes out," she said, taking a careful step forward. "If you hear your name, keep walking." Elise swallowed hard. "And if something touches me?" Mrs. Crow's eyes flicked to hers. "Pray it doesn't." They began to move, the faint glow following as if it were tethered to them. From somewhere deep in the dark ahead, a voice called her name. It was her father's voice. The sound pierced straight through her, bypassing every warning Mrs. Crow had given. It wasn't just the sound of her father's voice. It carried the exact warmth, the same steady cadence he used when she was a child and too scared to sleep. "Elise," it called again, a little closer this time. "Come on, sweetheart, this way." Her throat tightened. The leathery floor underfoot seemed to pull slightly in the direction of the voice, like a current tugging at her ankles. Mrs. Crow didn't stop walking, but her tone sharpened. "It's not him." "I know," Elise said, but the words felt thin. Her steps slowed. The voice came again, softer now, almost pleading. "Don't let her keep you here. You don't belong in this place. Just take my hand." A flicker of movement brushed the edge of the dim light, a shape low to the ground, keeping pace with them. Elise's stomach twisted as it slid just out of sight again, but the pull toward the voice grew stronger. "Elise," Mrs. Crow said without turning, "the floor listens. If you step where it wants, you won't come back." The shape darted closer, and for a brief second the light caught it. Her father's face stared back at her from something wrong. A body too thin, limbs jointed in ways that bent unnaturally. His smile was gentle, but the skin around it strained, twitching faintly. One of his arms reached out, fingers trembling in a way that seemed rehearsed. The floor beneath her softened, dipping slightly as if to encourage her forward. Mrs. Crow's hand shot back, gripping her wrist hard enough to sting. Eyes on the light. Elise tore her gaze away, focusing on the faint glow above them. She forced herself to match Mrs. Crow's steps until the voice faded, replaced once again by the sound of dragging, closer this time, heavier. The light began to dim. "Run!" Mrs. Crow said. The glow above them thinned into a pale thread, barely strong enough to paint their shadows on the shifting floor. Elise's pulse pounded in her ears as she matched Mrs. Crow's sudden pace, each step sinking slightly into the leathery surface. The dragging sound behind them quickened, joined by the faint, irregular thump of something heavy hitting the floor. Whatever it wasn't far. "Elise," the voice called again. But now it was wrong. Not her father's, not anyone she'd ever known. Too deep, too wet, the syllables stretched, like they were being pulled apart. "Don't answer," Mrs. Crow barked, her grip like a vice on Elise's wrist. "I'm not," Elise started, but the floor lurched beneath them. The shift was sudden, the surface tilting sharply as though the entire space had rolled on its side. Elise stumbled, catching herself on her free hand, the leathery floor warm and slick under her palm. It flexed slightly, as though something underneath had responded to her touch. The light above flickered, dimming so far she could barely make out Mrs. Crow's silhouette. The dragging sound stopped. Silence pressed in around them, thick and absolute, until a single tap echoed through the dark, sharp and deliberate, as if knuckles had struck the underside of the floor. Once, twice, 3 times. Elise's chest constricted. "It's the same knock," she whispered. Mrs. Crow's voice was low, strained. "It's not knocking for a door this time." The light flared suddenly, blinding in the black. And in that brief burning flash, Elise saw them. Hundreds of pale hands pushing upward from beneath the floor, pressing so hard the surface bulged with the shape of each palm. Then the light went out completely. The blackness was total, the kind that erased not just sight, but any sense of space. Elise couldn't tell if she was standing, falling, or floating. The floor still pressed up against her feet, but it shifted and pulsed in slow waves, as if breathing. Somewhere below, the hands moved, dragging, kneading, pushing. She felt them under her soles, under her toes, mapping her shape. "Elise," Mrs. Crow's voice came, steady and near. "Don't move." She froze, her lungs tight. From the dark beneath her came the faint scrape of fingernails tracing deliberate lines along the floor, outlining her feet. The sensation traveled upward, ankles, calves, until she felt cold fingers press against her knees from below, testing the surface like fabric stretched too thin. Something brushed her hand, not a grasp, not yet, just a slow, exploratory touch that lingered long enough to make her stomach turn. "Why aren't we running?" Elise whispered, her voice trembling. "Because if you move now, they'll know exactly where to break through," Mrs. Crow said. The dragging started again, circling beneath them, and Elise realized with sick certainty that it wasn't one set of hands, it was many, moving together, organized. One hand struck upward hard enough to make the floor buckle. Another followed, then another, each hit making the surface thinner, softer. "They're going to," Elise began, but a sudden vibration cut her off. The floor quivered under their feet, the hands pausing as if waiting for a signal. Then they all withdrew at once. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. "Why did they stop?" Elise asked. "Because," Mrs. Crow said slowly, "something else is coming." And from far ahead, deeper in the dark, a new sound began. Faint at first, then growing clearer. It was the ringing of a small silver bell. The first chime was delicate, almost careful, but the sound traveled impossibly far through the darkness, curling around Elise's spine like cold mist. Mrs. Crow's grip on her arm tightened. "Don't let it get close enough to see you." The bell chimed again, this time sharper, and the floor beneath them shifted as though reacting to it, stretching, elongating. Elise's balance faltered, her feet sliding slightly forward on the slick surface. "I can't even see it," she whispered. "That's the point," Mrs. Crow replied. The third chime came, louder still, And this time, Elise swore she felt the air move near her ear, as if the caller had leaned in to whisper, but hadn't spoken yet. A memory surfaced without warning. Her front porch back home, late at night, a knock she'd once ignored because she was too tired to answer. She could smell the damp wood of the railing, feel the chipped paint beneath her palm. It was so vivid, she almost forgot where she was. The bell rang again, and her knees buckled. The sound pulled at something deeper than her body, like it was hooking into her will itself. Mrs. Crow yanked her forward suddenly, and Elise stumbled after her, feet sliding over the strange, breathing floor. "We're leaving," the older woman said. "If it follows here, it's because the house wants it to." Elise forced her focus on the faint pressure of Mrs. Crow's grip. The bell rang again, closer, no more than a few feet away now, and she swore she heard a breathless laugh woven into the chime. Then, without warning, the floor dropped away beneath them. Elise had just enough time to gasp before they were falling, the bell's sound stretching into a single, endless note that followed them down into the dark. The fall wasn't fast, it was slow, deliberate, as though something unseen was lowering them into the dark on invisible threads. The endless chime of the bell thinned, fading into a metallic hum that vibrated in Elise's bones. She reached for anything to grab onto, but her hands met only air. Mrs. Crow, somewhere just above her, spoke in an even tone, like a teacher giving careful instructions. "Don't look down. Don't try to land on your feet." "Why not?" Elise called up, her voice trembling. "Because there's no floor where you think there is." The hum deepened. Shadows began to coalesce beneath them, not solid but textured, like shifting fog caught in a light beam. Shapes moved inside it. Elise squinted, trying to make them out, but the moment her eyes focused, she realized the shapes were faces. Dozens of them. Hundreds. They weren't floating. They were rising. The faces were stretched, their mouths open as though screaming, though no sound came out. Their eyes were wide and milky, following her descent with hungry precision. The fog between them pulsed faintly, like it had a heartbeat. One of the faces surged upward faster than the others, stopping just beneath her feet. It opened its mouth, impossibly wide, and from the hollow came a sound she knew instantly. 3 slow, patient knocks. Her body locked in place. The urge to answer was instant and overwhelming, the same as it had been her first night in room 5. Mrs. Crow's voice snapped like a whip. "Elise, look up!" She did. Above them, a dim ring of light appeared, small at first, then widening. An opening. The pull of gravity shifted, not dragging her down anymore, but pulling her up toward it. The faces below moved in unison, stretching upward, their features distorting in desperation as the opening grew brighter. The bell chimed once more, from somewhere impossibly close, and then Elise felt a cold, skeletal hand wrap around her ankle. The fingers were impossibly long, each bone pressing sharply into her skin through the fabric of her jeans. The cold sank deep, as if it were bypassing flesh entirely and touching bone. She kicked instinctively, but the grip only tightened, pulling her back toward the rising mass of faces. The bell chimed again, the sound vibrating through the hand that held her, making her leg ache from the inside out. "Don't fight it like that," Mrs. Crow called from above, her voice strained. "It wants you to pull away, gives it a reason to keep you." The faces were closer now, their mouths working faster, silent screams spilling from expressions of agony and hunger. The one with the knocking rhythm had begun to push higher than the others, its wide mouth opening and closing as though it could already taste her. The skeletal hand jerked hard, nearly dislocating her knee. She twisted midair, bringing the dead flashlight down against it with all her strength. The metal connected with a brittle snap, and the grip loosened just enough for her to wrench free. Mrs. Crow's hand shot down into the dark. "Now, Elise!" She grabbed it, the older woman's grip painfully strong, and felt herself hauled upward at impossible speed. the faces blurred beneath them, elongating unnaturally as they reached, but the pull toward the light was stronger now. The moment her head broke the edge of the opening, the bell's chime cut off. The cold vanished from her leg, replaced by the dizzying heat of sudden air. Mrs. Crow pulled her fully through and they landed on solid ground, wooden this time, though it groaned under their combined weight. Elise lay there gasping, staring up at a low, timbered ceiling. She sat up slowly and realized they were standing in what looked like an attic, dust motes drifting through thin shafts of light from a row of small, grimy windows. But something was wrong. Every single wall, floorboard, and beam was painted in the same deep, bleeding red as the door they'd passed earlier. The red paint glistened faintly, though the air was dry. It wasn't fresh, not exactly. It was as if the color itself was alive, seeping slowly from the wood instead of resting on it. Elise could smell it too, that same metallic tang she'd caught near the red door in the hallway, sharp enough to sting the back of her throat. Mrs. Crow helped her to her feet, but didn't let go of her arm. "We're too close now. Don't touch anything." Elise's gaze darted across the room. Old furniture sat beneath dusty drop cloths, but even the cloths were stained faintly red. Some pieces bulged strangely, as if the shapes beneath weren't chairs or trunks at all. One of the grimy windows let in a narrow spear of light, just enough to reveal marks along the floor, dragging lines deep and parallel, leading toward the far corner. In that corner stood another door. It was the same red as the walls, but unlike the hallway's red door, this one was small, no taller than Elise's shoulder. The paint here was fresher, wet enough that droplets clung to the edges of the frame and slowly rolled downward. Elise's stomach turned when she realized the droplets weren't drying, they were sinking into the floorboards, disappearing without a trace. "Is that?" she began. "It's hers," Mrs. Crow cut in, her voice low. "Whose?" Mrs. Crow didn't answer. She stepped between Elise and the small door. "You can't go near it. If you do, you won't leave the attic again." Elise tore her eyes away from the door, but it was like trying to look away from a bright light. You still saw the afterimage. The floor beneath the door shifted slightly, the wood bowing inward as though something was pressing against it from underneath. "Elise!" The voice came from the other side of the door. It was her own. The sound was quiet, but in the stillness of the attic, it might as well have been a shout. It wasn't an echo or a recording. It had weight, breath, the exact tremor she'd hear in her own voice when she was afraid. "Elise," it called again, softer this time, almost coaxing. "It's cold out here. Just open it for a moment." She took an involuntary step forward before Mrs. Crow's hand shot out, gripping her shoulder hard enough to hurt. "That isn't you," Mrs. Crow said. "I know," Elise whispered, but her feet still felt restless, as if some part of her wanted to prove the voice wrong. The red paint on the doorframe rippled faintly, and for the briefest second, she thought she saw the outline of a hand press against it from the inside. Long fingers pressing and sliding slowly down. "Let me in," her own voice urged, this time laced with a pleading note. "I can't stay here much longer." Elise's pulse thudded in her ears. "If it's not me, then what is it?" Mrs. Crow didn't look at her. "The part of you the house wants to keep. It makes a double. If you open that door, she takes your place." The attic seemed to grow warmer, the metallic scent thickening. The furniture under the drop cloths began to shift, faint bumps rising and falling beneath the stained fabric, as though something underneath was breathing. "Elise," the voice said again, but now it was lower, angrier. "You don't belong with her." The wood in the corner groaned, and the small red door bulged outward, as if whatever was behind it had put its full weight against it. Mrs. Crow's voice was steady, but her grip on Elise's arm tightened. "We have to leave. Now!" The attic's narrow staircase was across the room, but as Elise's eyes found it, she saw something moving at the top of the steps, a pale hand gripping the banister. The hand was impossibly white, its skin stretched so tightly over the knuckles that it looked almost translucent. It lingered there, fingers curled loosely around the banister, unmoving but deliberate, like it wanted them to notice before showing the rest. Elise's breath caught. "Is that not the one behind the door?" Mrs. Crow said grimly. "This is worse." The pale hand shifted, nails dragging slowly down the banister with a faint rasping sound. Then another hand appeared just above it, gripping the rail higher up. The thing was pulling itself up from somewhere below the stairs. A head rose into view, elongated, the skin sagging in strange places, the features only loosely arranged into something human. The eyes were wrong, set too far apart and too deep, their black irises reflecting no light. It didn't blink. The small red door behind them rattled violently, the other Elise pounding against it now, her voice fractured and furious. "She's lying! She's keeping you here! Open it!" The pale thing on the stairs tilted its head slightly at the sound, its gaze sliding from Elise to the red door, then back to her. Its mouth split into a jagged smile, revealing teeth that didn't match. Some too long, some too short, like they'd been stolen from different jaws. It began to move forward, each step painfully slow, the boards under its weight creaking loud enough to drown out the banging on the door. Mrs. Crow pulled Elise toward the far side of the attic. "We can't let either of them reach you." The pale thing's head twitched, and without warning, it lunged forward, covering half the distance between them in a single, unnatural motion. From behind, the red door slammed open, and her double stepped out. It was her. Every freckle, every loose strand of hair, every faint crease at the corner of her mouth. It was a perfect reflection. But the eyes, they were darker. Not black, not entirely, but with an absence of light that made them seem bottomless. The double smiled at her like they were sharing a private joke. Finally, Elise stumbled back until she hit a low, red-painted beam. Mrs. Crow stepped between them, her stance defensive, eyes darting between the two threats now closing in from opposite sides. "You need to stay behind me," Mrs. Crow murmured. The pale thing from the stairs crouched low, its head twitching in small, jerky movements as if deciding who to go for first. The double's gaze flicked toward it briefly, and Elise could swear she saw a flash of annoyance, like they were competing. Then the double turned back to her, voice lilting. "It's exhausting, isn't it? Pretending you're fine, pretending you're not afraid." Elise's mouth went dry. "You're not me." The double tilted her head. "I'm the you who doesn't have to pretend, the one who belongs here." She reached out a hand, palm up. "Come with me and it stops hurting." The pale thing took another slow step forward, nails scraping deep grooves in the floor. The air in the attic grew hot, thick and close, like being inside a furnace right before the fire roared to life. Mrs. Crow's voice was sharp now. "Elise, look at me. You're going to move when I say. And you don't look back." The double's smile widened. "She'll only lead you somewhere darker." The pale thing let out a low, wet sound, half breath, half growl, and launched itself toward them. Mrs. Crow shouted, "Now!" Elise ran, her feet pounded against the warped red boards, each step echoing louder than it should. The attic seemed longer than before, the far wall retreating as though the space itself was stretching. Behind her, the double's voice rose in a sing-song call. "You can't outrun me. I am you." The pale thing's pursuit was faster, its movements wet and ragged, nails screeching against the boards when it dragged itself forward. It didn't sound winded. Mrs. Crow stayed just ahead, cutting between stacks of covered furniture that shifted and twitched beneath their cloths as they passed. One shape under the fabric rose almost to her height, pressing toward her with a muffled groan, but Mrs. Crow shoved it aside without looking. Elise risked a glance back. Her double wasn't running. She was walking, calm and deliberate, but the attic seemed to bend around her steps, shrinking the space between them with every pace. The pale thing had veered slightly, almost circling, as though it intended to cut them off instead of following directly. They reached the staircase at the far end, a narrow, spiraling descent that disappeared into shadow. The railing here was warped, slick with the same dampness she'd seen on the red door. Mrs. Crow didn't hesitate, gripping the rail with her sleeve and starting down. "Don't touch the wood with your skin," she warned. Elise followed, her hands wrapped in her sweatshirt cuffs. The steps groaned and shifted under their weight, and somewhere far below she could hear water dripping in a slow, steady rhythm. Halfway down, the air changed, colder, thicker. She felt something brush her ankle, light as a strand of hair. Above them, the double's voice echoed down the stairwell. "You'll see. You'll want to come back." Then came another sound, quieter, but far closer. The pale thing was already waiting at the bottom. It crouched in the narrow space where the stairs met the lower floor, head bent forward at an unnatural angle so it could fit beneath the low ceiling. Its limbs were splayed like a spider's, fingers spread wide, the nails digging small crescents into the boards. The eyes gleamed in the dim light, twin pits of black that seemed to drink in what little glow the stairwell had. It didn't move when they stopped. It just waited, swaying slightly like a predator gauging the exact moment to strike. Mrs. Crow didn't break stride. "Stay close to me." "How?" Elise began, but the pale thing surged upward without warning. It didn't climb the stairs, it folded up them, its limbs bending in ways that weren't possible, propelling its body forward with unnatural speed. Elise stumbled back, slamming into the wall as Mrs. Crow swung something from her coat pocket, a small jar, the glass etched with symbols that caught the dim light. She hurled it at the thing. The jar shattered, releasing a burst of black smoke that twisted and writhed in the air like it was alive. The pale thing recoiled violently, its skin blistering where the smoke touched. It let out a shrill, piercing wail that vibrated through the boards under Elise's feet. "Go!" Mrs. Crow shouted, grabbing Elise's wrist and hauling her past it. The pale thing thrashed against the smoke, its movements jerky and desperate. But even as they passed, Elise caught sight of its mouth, open far too wide, revealing rows of teeth that seemed to grow as she looked. They burst into the lower room, slamming the door behind them. The dripping sound she'd heard earlier was louder here, and when she glanced around, she realized the walls glistened as though slick with condensation. Mrs. Crow leaned against the door, breathing hard. "It won't stay trapped for long." Something in the corner shifted, slowly, almost deliberately. And that's when Elise saw they weren't alone in this room either. At first it looked like just another shadow, slouched low against the damp wall. But then it moved, peeling itself upward, the motion accompanied by a faint sucking sound as though it had been stuck to the wall's slick surface. It was smaller than the pale thing, but wrong in a different way. The body was shrouded in something that looked like a soaked burial shroud, clinging so tightly to its shape that Elise could see the faint outline of ribs beneath. The fabric dripped steadily, each drop hitting the warped floor with that same slow, deliberate rhythm she'd heard from above. There was no face, only a smooth, dark hollow where one should have been. Mrs. Crow's voice was low but steady. "Don't look into it." "How can I not?" Elise began, but then she felt it. It wasn't looking at her, not with eyes, but she could feel its attention, a pull low in her stomach, like the ground had tilted and gravity itself was urging her forward. The hollow seemed to deepen, an endless tunnel she might fall into if she stepped just a little closer. Mrs. Crow moved between them, raising a hand that held what looked like a strip of tarnished silver. The figure stopped advancing, its dripping slowing for a moment before resuming, the drops louder now, as if impatient. "Elise," Mrs. Crow said without looking back, "there's a door behind you. Don't open it unless I say. Understand?" Elise nodded, but her feet felt heavy. The thing in the shroud was tilting its head slowly, as if listening to something only it could hear. From somewhere above came a faint, rhythmic pounding, her doubles fists against the attic floor. The hollow-faced figure took one more step forward, and the lights, if there had even been lights, dimmed until the room was nearly pitch black. Then, in that darkness, Elise heard it speak for the first time, her own voice again, but this time it was whispering from inside her head. It wasn't like hearing a sound. It was like remembering one you'd never actually heard. The voice bloomed in her mind, soft and close, bypassing her ears entirely. "She can't keep you safe forever." Elise's knees weakened. "Get out of my head," she whispered, before realizing she hadn't actually moved her lips. Her words stayed trapped in thought, but the thing heard them anyway. "You've already opened the wrong door once. One more and it's over. Don't you want to see what's behind it?" The pull toward the hollow deepened, a quiet, hungry gravity. Mrs. Crow must have sensed it because her voice snapped like a whip. "Elise, look at me, not at it." Elise forced her gaze away from the figure, but the sensation didn't fade. It was inside her now, tugging at the corners of her thoughts, making the door behind her feel impossibly important. The pounding from above grew sharper, the attic boards groaning under her double's weight. Between those strikes, she could hear the pale thing's low, wet rasp, closer than before, too close. The hollow-faced figure took another step, its shroud brushing the floor with a wet hiss. Mrs. Crow stepped forward and pressed the strip of tarnished silver against the figure's chest. There was a flash, not of light, but of absence. For a heartbeat, the figure's shape stuttered, like a glitch in a film reel, then reformed farther back in the corner. It didn't move for a long moment. Then it slowly turned its head toward the ceiling, as if acknowledging the noise from above. Mrs. Crow's eyes flicked to Elise. "We move now. The next room." The voice in Elise's head grew urgent, almost desperate. "Don't go with her. The next room is worse." But Mrs. Crow was already pushing her toward the door behind them. When Elise's fingers touched the handle, it was warm, too warm, as though someone had just been holding it from the other side. The warmth seeped into her palm, almost pulsing, like a heartbeat that wasn't hers. Elise froze, but Mrs. Crow's hand closed over hers, firm and unyielding. "Now," Mrs. Crow ordered, twisting the handle herself. The door swung inward with a groan, revealing a corridor that looked far too long to fit within the house's walls. Its floorboards were red, but darker than those in the attic, almost black in places, as though stained by something that had soaked deep into the grain. A faint, shuddering breath moved through the hallway, like the air itself was exhaling. They stepped inside. The door closed behind them without being touched. The walls here were tight, narrowing as they went, the red paint blistered and peeling in strips. Every few feet a closed door broke up the corridor, each one a different style, none matching. Some were plain wood, others ornate, and one was covered entirely in small square mirrors that reflected their movements in broken fragments. Mrs. Crow kept a brisk pace, but Elise's eyes kept snagging on the doors. She felt it again, that wrong kind of attention, except now it seemed to come from all of them. The mirrored door shivered faintly, as if something inside had brushed against its surface. Behind them there was a sharp metallic click, followed by the faint scrape of nails on wood. Elise turned just enough to see a pale hand slide around the frame of the door they'd just entered. Mrs. Crow hissed, "Don't look." But it was too late. The pale thing was already stepping into the hall, its limbs unfolding to fill the narrow space, shoulders nearly scraping both walls. Elise's double wasn't with it. That somehow felt worse. The thing began moving toward them in slow, deliberate steps, head tilting from side to side like it was savoring the chase. Mrs. Crow stopped in front of a door painted deep crimson, its surface carved with swirling patterns that seemed to shift if she looked too long. "This one," she said. "Now," she said. Mrs. Crow gripped the strange, swirling carvings like she knew exactly where to place her hands. The wood felt warmer here, almost feverish, and the air around it had a faint vibration, like the hum of distant machinery. The pale thing's steps grew faster, each thud making the floorboards tremble. Its head was lowering now, mouth opening just enough to reveal those mismatched teeth again. Elise's chest tightened. I know," Mrs. Crow snapped, twisting the carvings like knobs. There was a muffled click deep inside the wood. The pattern seemed to sink into the surface, and the door swung open. A rush of air pulled them inside, not forward like a wind, but sideways, as though gravity had tilted. Elise stumbled, catching herself on the frame as the world beyond the door tilted and warped, the hallway stretching away like a rubber band being pulled too far. Mrs. Crow shoved her through, then stepped in after her, slamming the door just as the pale thing lunged. Elise caught a last glimpse of its face, too close now, its skin straining over bone, as the gap between the door and frame snapped shut. They were plunged into dimness. It wasn't darkness, more like they were standing underwater in a place with no color. Shapes loomed in a heavy fog, barely visible. The ground beneath them was soft, springy, like walking on moss or sponge. Elise turned in place, trying to find the walls, but they were gone. The door was gone too. Mrs. Crow's shoulders slumped slightly, though she kept her voice calm. "It's not where I meant to go." Somewhere in the fog, a faint sound started. Footsteps, slow, even. Elise's stomach dropped when she realized she recognized the rhythm. They were her own footsteps. The sound came from directly ahead, muffled by the thick air but growing clearer. Each step landed with the same weight and pace Elise used when she walked. An exact echo. Mrs. Crow's hand came up in a silent signal to stop. "Don't speak," she murmured, barely audible. Elise held her breath as the footsteps drew closer, the fog ahead thinning just enough to reveal a silhouette. It was her height, her build. The figure's head was tilted down, hair falling forward in the same uneven way hers did after running. Then it looked up. Her own face stared back at her. This wasn't the smooth, smirking double from the attic. This one looked hollow. The skin was pale and loose, the eyes wide and unblinking, the mouth hanging open in a slack, unnatural way. When it breathed in, Elise could hear the faint, wet gurgle in its throat. It took a step closer, and Elise felt an almost magnetic pull to meet it halfway. Every part of her wanted to close the distance, some deep, instinctive recognition telling her it was safe, that it was hers. Mrs. Crow's fingers tightened painfully around her arm. "Don't move. It's not you. It's a holder." The figure's head jerked in small, rapid movements, like it was studying her. Then its lips began to move. At first, no sound came, just the unnatural shapes of words. Then Elise heard them in her own voice, distorted as if played backward. "Come home." Behind them, somewhere in the fog, another set of footsteps started up, heavier, dragging slightly, accompanied by the faint scrape of claws. Mrs. Crow swore under her breath. They found the way in. The hollow version of Elise's mouth twitched upward into a slow, warped smile, and then it started running. The thing sprinted toward her with jerky, lurching strides. Too fast, too wrong. Each step closed more distance than it should, like the space itself was helping it along. Elise stumbled backward, nearly tripping on the spongy ground. Mrs. Crow stepped between them, pulling something from inside her coat, a length of black cord wound tight around her fist. She snapped it forward, and the cord writhed like a living thing, lashing through the fog. It struck the hollow Elise across the chest. The figure jerked mid-stride, its smile vanishing as the cord wrapped around it and began tightening, sinking into its pale skin without breaking the surface. The thing let out a guttural, wet shriek. Mrs. Crow shouted, "Go! Now!" and shoved Elise toward a faint shimmer in the fog, like heat ripples over asphalt. Elise ran, the ground bouncing under her feet, but the fog resisted her movement as if trying to keep her in place. Behind her, she could hear the cord snapping and thrashing, the hollow's voice rising in a high, desperate wail. Then came another sound, the heavier, dragging steps from earlier, now fast and closing in. Something big was coming. The shimmer ahead grew clearer, revealing the outline of a door frame hanging in midair with no walls around it. Its surface pulsed faintly, as though it were breathing. Mrs. Crow caught up, grabbing Elise's wrist. "Don't think. Just through." They plunged forward together. The moment Elise crossed the frame, she felt a sensation like being yanked out of deep water, her ears popping, her lungs filling with sudden cold air. The ground beneath her feet turned solid and hard again. They landed in another hallway, this one narrow and dimly lit, with wallpaper so faded it looked like shadows clinging to the walls. Behind them, the door frame dissolved into nothing. Mrs. Crow exhaled, slow and tense. "One more door," she said. "That's all we'll get before it finds us again." From somewhere deeper in the hallway came the faint creak of another door opening. On its own. The creak stretched long and slow, like the hinges were savoring the sound. Elise's pulse thudded in her ears. At the far end of the hallway, a door stood ajar. No light spilled through the gap, only a still, heavy darkness that seemed to swallow the dim glow from the corridor. Mrs. Crow didn't move at first. She tilted her head, listening, her jaw set. "It's waiting," she whispered. A soft tapping began from within the open door. 3 taps, a pause, 3 taps again. The rhythm was steady, deliberate, and eerily familiar. Elise realized with a sick twist that it matched her heartbeat. The wallpaper on either side of them had begun to curl outward, peeling in slow motion. Behind the paper wasn't plaster, just more darkness, the same as inside the open door. Mrs. Crow's hand found hers, squeezing hard. "We go in together. Don't let go, no matter what." They started forward, each step muffled as if the hallway floor had grown soft. The tapping never stopped. 3, pause, 3, drawing them closer until the door's shadow fell over their feet. As they crossed the threshold, Elise felt the air change, thicker, warmer, with a faint metallic tang that coated her tongue. The door swung shut behind them with a sound like something locking from the inside. They stood in a small, square room. No windows, no furniture, just walls painted the exact deep red of the attic boards. In the center lay a single object, an old hand mirror with its glass cracked in a spiderweb pattern. Elise stepped toward it, and for the first time since they'd entered the house, there was no sound at all. She looked down into the mirror. The reflection that stared back wasn't hers. It smiled,